This is part two. We're going to continue our discussion today on chapter 8, Prison and the Correctional Client. So what I want to do is I want to start off by just talking a little bit about some statistics. These are, I know it's kind of old, it's 2008 stats, but we want to take a look at, there were about 1,800 state and federal correctional facilities. And we see the breakdown of maximum security, minimum security, and medium security. And you can kind of see how the breakdown was back then. You can also see that we had both public and private prisons. And basically what that means is our government, both state and federal, have contracted with civilian institutions to operate and run various prisons. At that time, there were 415 of them. So let's get back into our PowerPoint and let's advance it to where we left off and start talking a little bit about the pains of imprisonment. The pains of imprisonment, what we're referring to there is what the inmates actually experience. They experience, first of all, a deprivation of liberty. They're locked up. They're not free. They lose their freedoms. They have a deprivation of goods and services. They're very limited in what kind of actual property and things they can actually have. And it varies depending upon prison to prison and the various security levels. Deprivation of sexual relationships. Very, very, very few institutions provide or allow for conjugal visits. Deprivation of autonomy. Everybody is treated alike in these prison systems, and so you really lose that autonomy. Deprivation of security. And remember, we talked a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how one of those needs is security, and that level of security is not being met in the prison systems. And people have to adapt to that. And so they adapt to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about it by resulting to violence. So inmates, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll try to find ways to alleviate their pains. And they do this through their pseudo-families or their prison families. And not all prisoners experience pain in a similar way. When inmates are institutionalized in these prison environments, we talk a little bit about the total institution providing this environment for inmates to survive or live together. It's a shared experience of deprivation. And what happens is these environments, subcultures develop. And we're going to talk about the various subcultures, i.e. namely like the gangs. The prison subculture is a subculture where the norms and the values and the beliefs and the traditions and even the language of the prison is a little bit different than, in fact, it's very different from the outside world. Within the prison subculture, we have convict subculture. And the convict subculture is when inmates seek power and information so that they might get their goods and services they desire to alleviate those pains of imprisonment. I'm going to show you a little bit about what we're talking about here. In this diagram or informational chart, Focus 8.4, it's on page 171 in our book. Most notably, I want to point out the fish and the wolf. So this is all different roles that are assumed by inmates, and you can see how the language is, and you can read this for yourself in the book. But pointing out to the wolf is the inmate who, let me see if I can highlight that here. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. The wolf. The wolf is the inmate who aggressively and sexually pursues other inmates. He is believed to play a masculine role. There's no emotion or connection in the sexual act for the wolf. Rather, he pursues men in the prison and rapes them. Let's compare that to our fish. And here the fish is the inmate who has just arrived and is not yet adjusted to the ways of the prison. So you can see that these subcultures and these convict subcultures, they're different than the outside world. All right, jumping back to our all right. So we have a couple of slides that just talk about the convict subculture. Talks about how staff and inmates engage, and their engagement is more personal and informal than in the past. Diversification of staff has changed the old dynamic between staff and inmates. They've done some research on that. So let's talk about gangs. You guys have all done some research on gangs, and you found out that the various gangs that exist and the various organizational hierarchies of these gangs, and those gangs have permeated into our prison system. There's a long history of gangs in our system. According to the information that we have, gangs are just too numerous to even keep track of. It's mostly based on race or ethnicity. They're much stronger in the male prisons. They'll conspire with others to provide protection and increase their criminal reach. So the administrators are going to try to control and suppress the gang involvement by, number one, and first and foremost, identifying who the gang members are, separating members. They're going to monitor their activities. They're going to try to neutralize the gang members by punishing them, and they're going to reduce activities of the various gang members so that they can try to, again, control and suppress their involvement. So this slide asks or poses the question, why prisons are violent? Well, remember our statistic that about 50% of our state prison population is incarcerated for violent acts. So these are violent people coming into our prison systems to begin with. This report, produced under the First Step Act, collected some data, and what this report shows is, if we look at the federal prison system to give you an idea of even the violence against prison guards, we see that there were 1,270 physical assaults on Bureau of Prison staff by prisoners, with 21 of the assaults resulting in serious injury to the staff member. That translates into approximately 10 physical assaults per year on staff members in each one of the 122 federal prisons that exist. We've talked about the sexual assaults in the prisons. There is a Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003, and it requires the Bureau of Justice to collect yearly data on the amount of prison rapes that occur. The myths, yeah, they can contain some grain of truth. Prison rapes, they're probably unreported. Rioting, we've had some extensive prison riots. The Newgate prison in Connecticut is one of the most notable. When we talk about rioting, there's basically two types. One is violence used to achieve some end, or just violence because it's an angry outburst. What I can say about violence in the prison system is that every prison system is different. They're very, very unique in and of themselves. They all, to a large degree, will try different strategies to reduce their violence. Number one, first and foremost, they all are going to provide a high level of professionalism in their subculture, within their personnel, their supervision, their classification of prisoners, and the activities that are provided for within the system. There's formal grievance procedures that have been implemented. There's official reporting of violence, and there is a strong involvement of policymakers. In terms of the makeup of the inmates, some inmates develop an alternative means of adjusting, despite the issues such as mortification and prisonization. As the inmate matures, if you will, they're able to cope differently or better. But it's really a case of the standard of prison. So if they are to cope, it must be in a decent prison system. And it's important to remember that humans are social animals. We need socialization. We need support systems. Outside in the civilian world, there's friends, neighbors, schools, churches, not-for-profits, and governments where it helps the individual to grow and thrive. Within the system, within the prison systems, that's what's lacking. And so we have to substitute those social supports as best we can, or the inmates are going to create their own. Operating prisons is no easy task. The prisons have to address all populations and all situations. So they have to address inmates that are physically ill. They have to address the mental health issues, and that's huge within the prison system, extremely huge. The gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex inmates. These numbers are unknown, but it's big within the prison system. And protecting the sexual orientation of inmates is a real challenge for administrators. All right, so that's going to wrap up our Chapter 8. If you have any questions, make sure to get a hold of your instructor.